Let's begin here, because too many believe love must be proven by grand gestures, by constant declarations, or by dramatic pursuit. Yet the truth often arrives in a quieter form. It shows itself not in what is said, but in what is seen. A glance that lingers half a second longer than necessary. Eyes that search for you before words are spoken. In that space, without sound, the soul reveals more than the mouth ever dares to confess. Jung reminded us that the unconscious always betrays itself. It is the mask that can smile politely while the eyes tremble with a different truth. If you have ever felt a look pierce through appearances, you know this is where love speaks most honestly. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let us pause with this image of two eyes meeting and the world slowing down for a moment. Most dismiss such moments as coincidence or explain them away as habit. But the gaze is not accidental. It is the thin place where persona, the mask we wear for others, becomes transparent. Beneath it, the shadow waits carrying feelings we try to deny. When desire softens into reverence, when fear wrestles with longing, it slips through the eyes first. Too many look for signs of love in words alone. Words can be rehearsed. They can be controlled, even manipulated. The eyes, however, carry a rhythm of their own. They turn toward what matters, even when the conscious mind insists on turning away. They are the compass of the unconscious. And in that compass, north always points back to the beloved. What matters here is not romantic fantasy, but psychological truth. To recognize the gaze is to recognize the inner world that gives it shape. A man may try to act indifferent, but if the unconscious has chosen his eyes betray him. They search, they return, they glow. Jung would call this the moment where projection awakens, when the image within is cast upon the other, and suddenly the ordinary becomes sacred. This is why the gaze in love feels so different from a glance of desire. Desire fragments breaking the other into parts to be consumed. Love integrates, seeing the whole person and silently honoring them. And in that recognition, the gaze becomes a mirror. It shows not only the truth of the one who looks, but also awakens truth in the one who is seen. So, as we begin this reflection, hold on to this love rarely announces itself with certainty. It whispers through hesitation, through a pause in conversation, through the light that flickers quietly in the eyes. If you learn to see it, you may never again mistake performance for presence. We ended before with the reminder that love does not declare itself loudly. It reveals itself in the small pauses, in the rhythm of a gaze that returns even when the mask insists on turning away. And here, the first fracture appears. The eyes begin to betray the story that words are trying to hold together. How many times have you heard someone say, "It's nothing serious. Don't overthink it," while their glance lingers half a heartbeat too long, or they look away sharply, then return almost against their will. The conscious self insists on distance, but the unconscious cannot maintain the act. In Jung's language, this is the threshold where the persona, the social mask we wear to appear consistent and in control, begins to slip. And what leaks through that small break is often more revealing than any confession. The first fracture is rarely dramatic. It is often subtle, even clumsy. You might notice that his words are ordinary, almost careless, but his eyes carry an urgency his tone cannot disguise. This mismatch is not just awkwardness. It is the soul's way of telling on itself. The unconscious Jung reminded us always seeks expression. When it cannot emerge in words, it slips through gestures, through tone, through the eyes that glance too quickly and return too soon. There is something deeply human about this contradiction. The conscious mind wants to maintain the illusion of control. I am fine. I am indifferent. Nothing is happening here. Yet, beneath the shadow, moves restlessly. The shadow carries what has been denied: longing, tenderness, vulnerability, and it presses forward in moments when the mask is thin. That is why the first fracture often appears in the gaze. Eyes are harder to discipline than language. You may recognize this pattern not only in romantic settings, but in many areas of life. A colleague says the right words, but avoids your eyes too often. A friend insists she is not upset, yet her glance flickers with resentment. The fracture between word and gaze is the universal sign that the unconscious is pushing against the persona. We sense it instantly because part of us is always listening to more than speech. In love, the fracture carries a special intensity. When he pretends that your presence means little, but his eyes search for you the moment he enters a room, the truth is already exposed. The unconscious has already located what the conscious ego still denies. This silent scanning is not courtesy. It is the instinct to anchor oneself by finding the figure that matters most. It is the first confession whispered without sound. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The fracture calls your attention again and again. You begin to notice the repeated stumble, the eyes that linger, the head that quickly turns, the return glance that betrays desire and fear in the same instant. You see the shadow wrestling with the persona, and you recognize the cost of this conflict. For the one who looks, the price is inner tension, the strain of keeping feelings hidden. For the one who is seen, the cost is uncertainty, the question of whether to trust what is visible or what is spoken. Here lies the danger. If you cling only to words, you may believe the persona and ignore the truth that burns quietly beneath. If you cling only to glances, you may imagine meaning where none exists. The fracture is not meant to be used as proof, but as invitation. It tells us something deeper is stirring here, something the conscious mind cannot fully control. And in that stirring lies the possibility of real connection, but also the risk of self-deception. Jung taught that the shadow carries not only what we dislike, but also what we most long for. Love awakens this paradox in its purest form. The same man who insists on independence may reveal through his eyes a longing for closeness he does not dare admit. The same woman who appears confident may flicker with fear of rejection when her gaze falters. The fracture is where these contradictions surface. It is not weakness. It is the sign of an inner life struggling toward truth. Think of how often such moments occur at thresholds. A doorway, a hallway, the brief pause before greeting someone. The body has not yet composed its mask, and the unconscious steps forward first. Eyes search, reveal, confess, then quickly retreat as the persona catches up. If you are attentive, you will notice this again and again. It is the split second where honesty appears uninvited. In the language of individuation, the process of becoming whole, the first fracture is sacred. It is the moment when the unconscious shows its hand. The mask may insist I am complete, I am untouched, but the fracture reveals what the soul still longs to integrate. Love is not simply attraction. It is the recognition of something missing, something waiting to be called into the light. And the eyes are the first place this truth breaks through. But let us also be clear. The fracture is not comfortable. It exposes what someone hoped to keep hidden. This is why glances often carry both longing and fear. The fear is not only of being discovered, but of losing control. To love is to risk surrender, to risk being seen in one's weakness as well as strength. The persona resists, but the unconscious has already confessed. That is why the eyes look, flee, and return again, caught between desire and defense. For the one who receives such a gaze, the challenge is also great. To notice the fracture is to be entrusted with a truth the other may not yet admit to themselves. The temptation is to demand clarity, to ask for words, to force the mask to collapse. But Jung's teaching reminds us what is forced retreats back into the shadow. What is observed with patience has the chance to grow into consciousness. So the first fracture is not simply about detecting signs of love. It is about learning to see the subtle dance between mask and shadow, between what is spoken and what is revealed. It is the art of listening with the eyes. And in that listening, we are invited to step into deeper honesty with ourselves. For if another's gaze can betray what lies beneath, so can ours. How often do we say, I am fine, while our eyes plead for understanding? How often do we pretend indifference, while our glance betrays attachment? To notice this fracture in others is to be reminded of it in ourselves. The gaze is a mirror. It shows us that the human heart is rarely consistent, rarely whole without effort. We are creatures of contradiction, balancing persona and shadow, trying to appear strong while longing to be seen. Love does not resolve this instantly. It begins with these fractures, with the moments when we are caught off guard and truth leaks through. And so this part of the journey teaches us to pay attention not only to the gaze that seeks us, but to the places where our own eyes stumble. For it is here in the fracture that individuation begins, not by judging or denying, but by noticing with clarity. What we deny, Jung said, controls us. What we accept begins to transform us. The same is true in love. The fracture is not the failure of the mask. It is the beginning of wholeness. As we move deeper into this reflection, hold on to this. The eyes are not only windows through which love looks out, they are mirrors through which the unconscious calls us to honesty. To ignore them is to miss the truth. To honor them is to begin the work of becoming whole. The fracture begins small, as we reflected before. A word spoken casually, an eye that lingers too long, and suddenly the mask slips. But what happens when that slip is not a single accident, but a pattern? This is where the deeper struggle begins, the contest between the persona that wishes to remain polished and in control, and the shadow that longs to reveal its hidden truth. The persona is the face presented to the world. It is the role, carefully rehearsed, the polite greeting, the measured tone. It is necessary for social life, for order, for the appearance of balance. Yet beneath this surface, the shadow carries everything the persona cannot hold. Longing, fear, vulnerability, even tenderness. The eyes become the battlefield where these two forces collide. When someone is moved by love, the persona strives to appear calm. Words are chosen carefully. Gestures are restrained. But the shadow insists on breaking through. It directs the gaze. It interrupts the mask it reveals, longing in a glance that returns when it should not. This is not weakness. It is the unconscious declaring what the conscious ego is not yet ready to admit. Think of the rhythm of a glance that falters, turns away, then returns. It is almost contradictory avoidance and confession in the same second. He hides, and yet he hopes to be seen. This is the ancient conflict, the warrior who guards his territory, and the lover who longs to cross it. The tension is visible in the eyes because the eyes are less disciplined than the mouth. They betray the heart's divided will. Jung observed that when the mask grows too rigid, the shadow pushes harder for expression. The unconscious refuses to be silenced. That is why the signs of love appear in strange, repeating gestures. The doorway glance that seeks her presence before the head turns politely to the crowd. The scanning of a room, always returning to the same figure, no matter how often the persona insists on neutrality. The unconscious does not tire. It repeats, and in repetition, it confesses. This inner struggle is costly. For the one who looks there is constant tension, a body that betrays what the mind denies, a glance that exposes what the tongue tries to bury. For the one being looked at, there is equal burden to sense affection in the gaze while hearing denial in the words. This contradiction creates confusion, sometimes even suffering. But it also creates the stage for awakening, for the possibility of deeper seeing. It is important to remember that the shadow is not simply darkness or corruption. It is also what has been repressed because it did not fit the persona's design. Vulnerability, tenderness, the longing to belong, these qualities are often hidden because the mask demands strength, composure, self-sufficiency. Love breaks that illusion. It forces the unconscious to reveal what has been denied. The eyes tremble with the weight of this revelation. Observe carefully, and you will see the paths the gaze begins to draw. Not the flat stare of indifference, but a wandering triangle from eyes to lips, from lips back to eyes, as if rehearsing a confession the persona refuses to speak aloud. This is the shadow at work, creating patterns that the ego cannot easily explain. And in those patterns, the deeper truth is written. Yet with this truth comes risk. If the shadow overwhelms the persona, the person may retreat into defense. The gaze becomes stiff, controlled, sometimes even cold. This is not the absence of feeling, but the excess of it. Too much vulnerability can frighten the conscious mind, and so the eyes try to hide again. The pendulum swings open, then closed, near, then distant. Anyone who has watched such a struggle knows the exhaustion it brings. Why does this matter? Because to recognize the struggle between persona and shadow in another's eyes is to recognize the same struggle in ourselves. We too wear masks. We too feel the pull of emotions that break through when least convenient. In love and grief and joy, the eyes confess what words refuse. And in that confession, we see how little control the ego truly has. This does not mean that every wandering glance is love, nor that every contradiction reveals depth. Projection plays its part. We sometimes see what we long to see, interpreting every flicker as proof of what we hope is there. That is why Jung warned us the unconscious is powerful, but it is not always clear. It speaks in symbols, in gestures, in half-revealed truths. The work is to discern, not to cling. Still, when the shadow presses against the persona, something remarkable happens. The human being becomes transparent for a moment. The eyes open a doorway into what is usually hidden, a longing for closeness, a fear of surrender, a vulnerability that had been carefully concealed. If you have ever felt someone's gaze soften when you spoke of something fragile, you know this moment. The mask hardens for most of the world, but with you, it bends. That is the shadow daring to trust. And yet, this is not only about the other, it is also a call inward. For how often do our own eyes betray what we hide? How often do we pretend strength while our glance pleads for comfort? How often do we say, "I am fine," with lips, while the eyes shimmer with unspoken need? The drama of shadow and persona is not a spectacle we observe in others. It is the inner conflict we live each day. To grow into individuation, to become whole, is to acknowledge this battle with honesty. To admit that the mask cannot hold forever. To recognize that the eyes reveal because the soul longs to be seen. This is not a failure of discipline. It is the first step toward integration. What is hidden in the shadow must eventually find its place in consciousness, or it will continue to leak through in fractured, painful ways. So, in this third part of our journey, we see more clearly the hidden drama played out in glances and pauses. It is not just about detecting love in another's eyes. It is about recognizing the universal struggle to reconcile what we present with what we feel. The persona wants order, dignity, protection. The shadow demands release, honesty, risk. The eyes hold both, and in that tension, the truth of the heart is exposed. To ignore this struggle is to live in confusion, mistaking masks for reality. To notice it is to enter the work of deeper seeing. And in that work, we are drawn closer to ourselves, closer to one another, and closer to the mystery of love that speaks most honestly through silence. We have followed the fracture where the mask slips, and we have watched the silent battle between persona and shadow play out in a man's eyes. Now, something deeper begins to appear. The unconscious is not satisfied with glances alone. It seeks to clothe itself in symbols, in gestures that cannot be trained or rehearsed. This is the stage of awakening where the gaze reveals not only desire, but the stirrings of archetypes within the soul. At first, the signs are subtle. A glow in the eyes that no act can imitate. Not a glare of possession, not the sharpness of demand, but a warmth that seems to soften the entire face. the moisture of the iris, the quiet steadiness of attention. These are the marks of something larger than the ego. Jung would say that projection has occurred. The image of the anima, the feminine presence within the male psyche, has found its reflection in the woman before him. It is as if an inner constellation has lit up, and the eyes now carry its radiance. This glow is not greedy. It does not reduce her to a part or a role. It treats her as a place of reverence, a place where the soul feels at home. That is why the gaze lingers with gratitude, not with hunger. It is not the stare of conquest, but the soft attention of someone who has found water in the desert. When such a look is given, the one receiving it often feels a quiet recognition in return, as if the eyes are saying what the tongue cannot. You are seen as whole, not divided. To experience this is to touch the realm of archetypes. The gaze begins to mirror the king, not in dominance or pride, but in the capacity to hold space with steadiness. When you speak of something fragile, when you share a dream or a fear, his eyes remain calm. They do not wander, they do not harden, they do not close. Instead, they remain present, as if offering a vessel strong enough to contain your feelings. This is not performance. It is the archetype of the mature masculine awakening, the one who protects not by force, but by presence. And here lies a profound truth. The gaze does not only reveal personal longing, it reveals the stirrings of the collective unconscious. When the king archetype awakens, it is as though the soul has remembered its ancient role to offer shelter, to bear witness, to honor the sacred in another. A man may not understand this consciously. He may even deny it. But the eyes speak with an authority deeper than thought. Notice how this awakening often shows itself in silence. In the midst of laughter, in the noise of a room, the gaze finds her again and again. It is not always accompanied by words, nor does it demand a response. It is enough to look, to confirm, to anchor. This returning glance becomes a thread invisible yet unbreakable. The unconscious has chosen its orientation, and the eyes cannot help but follow. Thresholds intensify this awakening. In half-lit hallways, in the pause before a door closes, in the dimness of evening, the gaze grows braver. Light and shadow meet, and in that liminal space, the unconscious dares to reveal what daylight would suppress. These are the moments when tenderness floods the eyes, when armor falls away for a breath. It is here that the archetype of the lover emerges vulnerable, childlike, filled with wonder. For a moment, innocence and desire are reconciled, and the eyes confess a purity words would only spoil. Dreams echo this process. After an encounter charged with meaning, the unconscious continues its work at night. Images of water, of windows, of trains, or puzzle pieces appear, each symbol pointing toward union. By morning, the eyes carry the residue of these dreams. Not tiredness, but a quiet depth, as if the night has prepared the soul to see more clearly. When he looks, then it is not merely as a man awake from sleep, but as someone who has touched another layer of reality. The awakening is not limited to him alone. The one who is seen is also invited into greater consciousness. To receive such a gaze is to be mirrored in a way that strips away the trivial. You begin to see yourself not only as body or role, but as soul. The glow in his eyes awakens the glow within you. This is why such encounters can feel transformative. They remind us of our own wholeness even when we had forgotten. But awakening is not without fear. When the archetypes stir, when the unconscious surges forward, the ego resists. Too much intensity can cause retreat. The gaze may harden suddenly or turn cold as if nothing had happened. This is not because nothing was felt, but because too much was. The persona reasserts itself, trying to restore order to cover what the unconscious has revealed. And yet the glow returns again. It cannot be suppressed for long, because what has awakened seeks life. Here we see the paradox of love through Jung's lens. Love is not simply an emotion. It is an archetypal force, an encounter with the self that pushes both people toward individuation. The gaze that glows with reverence is not merely personal affection. It is a sign that the unconscious is moving, that deeper integration is possible. In the eyes, we glimpse the archetypal dance of lover and king of child, and warrior of shadow and light. When you recognize this glow, pause. Do not rush to define it or to demand a promise. Let it be what it is, a revelation of the soul through the fragile window of the eyes. In such moments, both people are invited to step closer to their true selves. And whether the relationship continues or not, the awakening has already occurred. The light has entered and the unconscious has spoken. Awakening, as we have seen, does not end with revelation. It places a responsibility before us. Once you recognize the glow in another's eyes, once you see the archetype awaken, the question becomes, what will you do with it? For seeing alone is not enough. Clarity without action leaves the soul restless. Love calls not only to recognition, but to choice. This is where many falter. To notice the gaze is to feel both beauty and burden. It is tempting to cling to the signs, to treat them as trophies or proof of power. But when you do this, the sacred becomes distorted. Jung reminded us that what we grasp for control always slips back into shadow. The gaze is not given to be used. It is given to be honored. Boundaries emerge here as a form of reverence. To set a boundary is not to reject love, but to guide it into clarity. A woman who knows her worth does not collect glances like coins, nor does she demand constant reassurance. She slows her own gaze, holds it gently, returns it with presence rather than possession. By doing so, she teaches the rhythm of dignity, a rhythm that transforms longing into respect. Consider the difference between manipulation and mindful response. When the glow in his eyes is treated as a weapon, the connection withers. Suspicion grows, games replace honesty, and the sacred is profaned. But when it is received with calm awareness, when you allow it to be what it is, without twisting it for advantage, then love has room to breathe. It becomes not a test, but a temple. This is why boundaries are not cold walls, but living gates. They signal what may enter and what must remain outside. If his gaze speaks truth, but his words deny it, you do not need to force him to confess. You allow the contradiction to stand while holding your own clarity. If his eyes linger with reverence, but his actions fail to match you, step back, not in anger, but in respect for yourself. This is individuation in practice, choosing wholeness over illusion. When you set such boundaries, you shift the balance of power. The one who hides behind persona expects you to chase, to interpret, to prove. But when you remain still, when you do not grasp or demand, the burden of truth returns to him. Jung taught that what we refuse to carry for another, they must carry themselves. By not taking ownership of his hidden desire, you invite him into his own work of integration. And here is the paradox. True boundaries do not diminish intimacy. They deepen it. They make space for what is real to grow without being clouded by fantasy or manipulation. A man who truly loves is not diminished by a woman's clarity. On the contrary, he is strengthened. For in her refusal to be reduced, he sees the image of self, the wholeness he seeks within himself. Let us reflect on how this choice feels in practice. When you slow your gaze, when you hold it like a lamp on the table, you say without words, "Here is my presence. Here is my clarity. Now, show me yours." If love is there, his eyes will return with steadiness. If it is not, the silence will reveal it. Either way, clarity is won. This is the gift of boundary. It ends confusion without violence. In this way, the gaze becomes a dialogue not of manipulation, but of truth. Your eyes, calm and unhurried, invite him into the same presence. Your silence resists the games of the persona, and his response, whether he leans in with honesty or retreats into denial, reveals the path ahead. This is not cruelty. It is the discipline of love. The deeper lesson here is that the gaze is not only his to reveal, but yours to govern. You too carry the shadow and the persona. You too may glance when you mean to look away, or deny what your eyes have already confessed. To set boundaries with another is also to set them within yourself. Do not allow your own gaze to be scattered, restless, searching for proof of worth in every pair of eyes. Let it be focused, steady, rooted in self-respect. When this balance is found, when both people honor the truth of the gaze without exploiting it, desire and respect are reconciled. The lover and the king stand side by side. Attraction no longer fragments the beloved into parts, but sees the whole. Reverence no longer hides in shadow, but walks openly in light. This is transformation, not the end of longing, but its elevation. And yet not all awakenings lead to union. Sometimes the gaze reveals a love that cannot be carried forward. Sometimes the persona refuses to yield, or the shadow overwhelms the balance. In such cases, boundaries protect the soul. To step away with clarity is not defeat. It is fidelity to truth. Better to honor the sacredness of what was seen than to twist it into something it is not. Here lies the heart of individuation, choosing presence over illusion, clarity over confusion, truth over performance. The eyes may reveal, but only the conscious act of setting boundaries transforms revelation into growth. Without this choice, we remain trapped in the endless cycle of longing and denial. With it, we step closer to wholeness. So Let us name this transformation clearly. The choice is not whether someone loves you, nor whether you can extract proof from their gaze. The choice is how you respond to what is revealed. Do you manipulate, or do you honor? Do you grasp, or do you let presence speak? Do you betray your own dignity, or do you stand as the temple through which love may pass? Jung once said, "What we accept transforms us." Boundaries are acts of acceptance. They accept what is truly there, without pretending, without forcing. They allow the unconscious to rise into light or to fall back into shadow, without your life being consumed by its contradictions. This is freedom. This is transformation. And as you practice this freedom, you will notice that your own gaze changes. It no longer searches anxiously for signs. It no longer betrays desperation or fear. It becomes calm, steady, luminous. It shows others the rhythm of respect, and in that rhythm, love either flourishes or fades. Both outcomes are gifts, for both bring clarity. This is the power of boundary, not to control another, but to protect the sacredness of love. Not to close yourself off, but to create the conditions in which truth can grow. It is the turning point where awakening becomes transformation, where seeing becomes choosing, and where desire becomes dignity. We have walked through the stages of the gaze, from the first fracture, where the mask slipped through the struggle of persona and shadow into awakening, and then the act of choosing boundaries with clarity. Now, we arrive at closure, where the meaning of all these reflections comes into focus. The central truth is simple. The eyes never lie for long. They reveal what the words conceal. They carry the glow of the unconscious, and they point toward what the soul values most deeply. To notice this is not to gain power over another. It is to step into the mystery of human connection with greater honesty. A man in love does not only look at you, he sees you as whole. His gaze does not fragment you into pieces of desire, but integrates you into a single presence. There is reverence in his attention, even when longing is present. That is the unmistakable difference between possession and love. Possession consumes, love honors. Yet this recognition is not meant to be turned into a checklist. If we approach the gaze with fear, we will invent signs where none exist. If we treat it like evidence, we will corrupt its truth. The gaze is sacred. It is the point where two souls touch without words, where the unconscious reaches forward, and where something greater than either individual stirs. Jung once said, "What you accept transforms you." To accept what you see in another's eyes is to allow clarity to enter. It may confirm love, or it may reveal its absence. Both are gifts, for clarity spares us from confusion, and confusion is what drains the spirit most. In the light of clarity, we either step forward with peace or step away with dignity. To hold another's gaze is also to accept responsibility. Looking back is not a trivial act. It carries weight. You can honor what you see, or you can play with it carelessly. To honor is to offer steadiness to mirror presence, to let the glow grow naturally. To misuse it is to wound, to twist what was sacred into a game. The choice reveals not only who the other is, but who you are. This is where individuation enters. The gaze of love is not meant to trap you in another's unconscious. It is meant to awaken your own. When someone looks at you with reverence, they are also showing you the mirror of your own worth. To accept that reflection without shrinking, without apologizing, is to step closer to the self, the wholeness Jung spoke of as our true aim. And so the final lesson is not about him, or even about whether love survives. The final lesson is about clarity. You may lose people, you may lose illusions, but you will not lose the truth you have seen. Once the eyes reveal it, you cannot return to blindness. Clarity remains. It becomes your anchor, your guide. When you walk through the world with this kind of sight, you notice differently. You no longer cling desperately to words, nor do you mistake every passing glance for destiny. You observe with presence. You discern with calm. And in this presence, love either deepens or fades, but it does so in the light of honesty. That is freedom. That is maturity. There is beauty in this kind of seeing, a beauty that goes beyond appearance, beyond desire, into the realm of soul. To be seen truly and to see truly, this is one of life's greatest gifts. For in that moment, everything not born of love falls away. The unnecessary pretenses, the empty performances, the restless fears all become impossible when confronted with the quiet power of genuine presence. So, let us close with this reflection. The gaze is not a trick to be learned, nor a secret code to be cracked. It is a mirror one that shows you both the unconscious of another and the truth of your own worth. If you accept it with reverence, it will not only change how you love, it will change how you live. Take a moment to let that truth settle in you. Remember the times when someone's eyes told you what words could not. Remember the clarity you felt, whether it brought joy or sorrow. That clarity was the gift. That clarity remains with you still. Before we end, I invite you to reflect what gazes in your life have revealed something you once overlooked. Write it in the comments if you wish. Sometimes sharing the moment is the first step toward honoring it. And as you leave this reflection, carry with you a simple truth. To see truly and to be seen truly is the beginning of love and the beginning of wholeness. Guard that truth gently, for once you learn to look this way, the world will never look the same again.